Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming this morning, and also everyone here at the Bangalore International Centre, and who have put on just the technicians and the people who installed the show and everything. So really beautiful job. I'd also like to thank everyone at Marg. We have Jyotsna here, but also Manasi, Sarah, and Narman Ahuja, the editor, who not only have organised this event and the show upstairs, but like working with them. If you ever get a chance to work with Marg to sort of put an issue together or be involved, it's just a fabulous experience, and they make everything so beautiful. And also, of course, Ahalya Matthan and Giti Datt for being part of this too. Okay, so what I'm going to do today is I'm going to make a few comments about both a little mini history of smell theory and perfumery history in sort of ancient, early medieval India, and then we're going to move to a discussion with Giti and Ali about the more focused on the magazine, but also on their various practices and experiences working with and researching smells and perfumes of various sorts. And then, so that's the main thing, what we're going to do. So I'm going to, hang on a sec, little clicker here. So here's starting this little image here we'll get to at the end. Got a nice image of some sandalwood paste there with that has camphor and saffron mixed in with it. That's at a Jain temple in Bikaner, in fact. But just sort of hold on to that image because various things to bear in mind. It's freshly made, it's coloured, it would be tactile, sort of multi-sensory substance. Just hold that thought. So before we kind of get into perfumery, I just want to give a little rundown of some basics, just keep it quite simple today, on theories and characteristics in these more ancient texts. I'm sort of talking mainly things from maybe the first millennium and maybe before, and maybe a bit later in South Asia, typically in Sanskrit texts, some Pali texts. That's what I typically work on. There's a lot of things I don't work on, and there's a lot of room for additions to this conversation. So smell, the sense of smell is closely associated in philosophical texts with the element earth. There's a kind of, in some more Hindu philosophical discourses, there's a kind of hierarchy, not quite a hierarchy, almost like a sort of pyramid of sensory densityness. So, say Akasha is only associated with the sound, and say wind, you can feel wind, you can hear wind, but you can't smell wind, you can't see wind. It's kind of thinner wind, you can't taste wind. Whereas earth, which has smell, which has the quality of smell, has all the sensory possibilities. So if you think of a sort of smelly lump of mud or clay, you can smell it, but you can touch it, you can see it, you could hear it at a pinch. It's the most multi-sensory element. And I might mention in passing as well that not just is it philosophically associated with earth, but there is this sort of long-standing celebration of the scent. I'm sure people in this audience know. I feel like I'm used to talking to Americans a lot of the time. Celebration of the scent of wet earth, like after the first rains, in say poetic texts. And actually, one of the things that's floating around the room is this ittar, which is actually a sort of distilled clay pots, which is a really remarkable sort of mineral-based natural perfume. They make, say, I think the one that got this probably from Ganoj. Another thing about smell is that the way it works, the theory of the way smell works is that a thing like this, like some jasmine, that will be made of earth because it has an odor, and then particles from that, which have the quality of an odor, leave this and sort of contact my nose, and they'd be carried by the wind. So it's kind of a complex sense in the sense that it's a contact sense, like touch or taste. There needs to be actual physical contact with these particles on my nose to experience it. But it's a remote sense, like hearing and seeing. because the thing I'm smelling can be like quite far away from my body, and there's this transportation of little tiny parts to my nose. And the thing that does that is the wind. The often, one synonym in Sanskrit, the wind is sort of odor carrier. So that's a sort of really important thing about smell, is it's sort of both remote and contact. So it kind of has this sort of intimate closeness, but also has this ability to connect me to things far away. So you get many a poem where somebody is a Sanskrit poem where, as is often the case in Sanskrit poetry, somebody's sort of pining for some absent lover who's far away, and they will go, "Oh, wind, please caress the body, the sandalwood-scented body of my lover, and come over to me, and sort of let me smell my lover from afar," and things like that. So it can kind of connect like that. So that's how smell works. Let's see. And there's various classifications of sensory objects in these philosophical texts, which are rather interesting, kind of things like the primary colors. The one for smells is typically, and there's a few variants, but the most common one is like good smell and bad smell, which is interesting as well, because it depends on the sort of philosophical system. But it's not, it can be the case that this good smell and bad, sort of good odor and bad odorness is actually a property, a sort of objective property of the thing that has the smell. It's sort of, it's like redness or sort of hotness. It actually belongs to the entity. So they're sort of located in the world, these good and bad smells. They often give examples of these good and bad smells in these texts to kind of illustrate. And so good smell, very common example given is sandalwood. And the most common bad smell is corpse. So rotting flesh, which is why I called my book Sandalwood and Carrion, because that's the kind of poles of the spectrum of odors. What do odors do in many literary texts? When I talk about this kind of stuff, say in America or Europe, people often mention this notion of odors triggering memories and sort of taking people back, which, does indeed happen, but that's not something that they really emphasize hugely. It sometimes comes up a bit, but it's not a really big thing in these ancient Indian texts, say the epics or sort of Sanskrit poems. What tends to happen in there is that they connect people over space, which really fits, if you think, with the kind of theory of smell of like odorous thing over there, wind brings it to me. I experience this thing, which is not actually sort of to hand right now, and I'm like, where does that come from? And I sort of go off and find it. So you sort of see that, say, in the Mahabharata with Matsya Gandhi, who smells a fish, and then she smells gorgeous afterwards, and people go after her. But you see this quite a lot, this idea that you smell something, and you're like, I need to kind of go to where that is. So actually, for example, in this sort of story of Krishna, when Putana, who's sort of stinky, in fact, when they sort of when Putana is dead and they cremate her body, she smells of agar wood in some versions, and this attracts people. They're like, "Where's that amazing smell coming from?" And they go and therefore sort of encounter baby Krishna. But that's the main thing, is kind of bringing people or repelling people. Repelling people, making people move away. But it's a spatial thing. Classic example being the bee attracted to the fragrant flower, and of course this may be it might be greed, it might be lust, it might be bad. Going towards this sort of fragrant object can have good and bad results. So that's the basics of smell. I could say a lot more there. Perfumery. This is a huge topic. There's mentions of perfumes even in sort of the Vedas, very early texts. They mention guggulu, they mention costus, root, their garlands, and things like that. So evidently there were sort of aromatics there. And if you imagine, say, the Vedic sacrifices, that would have been a very odorous event as well. Like the sort of putting things in fires. And there's also mentions of aromatics in the epics as well, especially things like sandalwood and agar wood, pastes, flowers, garlands. Garlands are a really key part of this as well. And yet again, I think garlands, they're multisensory. They're tactile, like this feels nice and cool, and they're visual. So this multisensory aspect of these perfumes is absolutely key to understanding them. let's see. Actual recipes for perfumes appear from approximately the mid first millennium onwards. And then after you get more and more perfume texts, they're actually very difficult to read, to be honest, because it's hard to kind of like translate a lot of these names for herbs and spices and things like that. And also, they're sort of often describing technical processes, which is, if you ever deal with ancient languages, sort of describing a process is always really hard to sort of, unless you know what it looks like already, it's hard to make sense of that. So they are rather difficult texts, but we actually have a relatively decent number of these perfumery texts. Another thing I find a bit with some of the maybe some of the later ones is it's a very specialized area. So you sometimes get the feeling that the people who were sort of copying out the manuscripts, say if it had been some sort of, I don't know, piece of Kalidasa, they'd have sort of, it would have been fine. But because it's this super specialized name for herbs, the copyists might have been a bit like not quite sure about the correct forms. So they can be a bit messy as well, these texts, to deal with. So what were these perfumes made out of? Various things. Some were sort of common everyday things like vetiver root, which sort of grew, relatively locally. And then some were imported, clearly, and celebrated as imported. And they were sort of costly, rare, exotic spices. So, for example, camphor. When camphor first appeared, that was coming from parts of Southeast Asia. It was this sort of naturally occurring Borneo camphor, sort of appearing in little sort of crevices in trees. Incredibly valuable at that point before they had distilled camphor. And it is sort of celebrated as this sort of rare, expensive stuff, or sort of musk from sort of northern regions. So within India, there is this concept of there's these places like sort of where Turushka resin, sort of from the west, where this sort of land of Turushka trees, which is sort of far away and full of precious aromatics, and you have that kind of story being told in Indian texts, and that adds to the allure of these substances as well. The lists of what aromatics are used does seem to expand over time. So, say in the epics, the main ones will be sandalwood, which is a complex entity in itself. It's not just one thing. And agar wood, which we can talk a bit about later. They're very contrasting. Sandalwood is sort of often sort of yellowy white in color. There's red sandalwood as well. And then agar wood is seen as black. And sandalwood is cooling. Agar wood is heating. That's another sort of important variable with all this stuff. And then later texts, by the time you get to about, I don't know, say the year 500 or something, you get this kind of common list of sandalwood, agar wood, camphor, musk, and saffron. And later still, about 1,000 years ago, people start mentioning civet, this stuff from the civet. And later still, you get ambergris mentioned as well. So the sort of gamut of substances does expand over time. And distilled perfumes seem to appear, and like actually this is something actually Giti's interested in. We've sort of not got the sort of final word yet on exactly when these sort of things like distilled attars and things like rosewater appeared. Maybe mid-late, sometime about the mid-second millennium, maybe a bit later. But that's not sure. But there's many processes in perfumery, even when you don't have distillation. So there's you can make things into powder, you can make things into pastes. Really interesting solvent extraction of things like jasmine, because things like jasmine, if you just sort of boil it, it's not good. You know what I mean? You don't get like a nice substance. And you still get this for making hair oils in India, but it goes way back, where you could layer jasmine with sesame seeds and sort of then after a day chuck out the jasmine and put new jasmine in and do this many, many times until the sesame had absorbed. It's a solvent extraction, basically. And then you crush the sesame and you get this solvent extracted jasmine oil. So really ingenious ways of extracting fragrance, even at very early periods. Let's see. Okay. One, as well as the sort of multi-sensory aspect of these aromatics, they're colored and they're tactile and things like that. One thing to emphasize that I just had to write a piece for a French thing about this, and with a little bit of distance, because I wrote this book like over 10, like 15 years ago or something now. One thing that really stands out with a bit of distance from it is how much it's all about sort of mixing in combinations. And it's not just, doesn't just happen to be about that, but there's almost like a very self-conscious sort of celebration or fascination with combinations as part of perfumery. It's kind of key to it in these earlier periods. So one, there's many formats. That's a really important thing. It's not just like, where's your perfume? Oh, it's that stuff in the bathroom. You squirt it on. That's it. You know what I mean? Like, and it's kind of invisible as well. That's not how it was. There were many formats. So there would be oils, like I just described. There'd be powders. You might put them on clothes. Incense, yet again, you might sense your hair. You might sense your clothes. Garlands, pastes, like the paste I showed at the beginning. Many, many different formats. And they were used on different parts of the body, and the mouth perfumes, hair oils, different parts of the body and different times of the day. And actually, the way some of the texts organize this is they start with the stuff you'd use in the morning, maybe things like toothsticks, maybe barn perfumes, like for beetle chewing. And then you kind of move through the day, and then they often finish with incenses that you would sort of burn in the bedroom at night. Which might have erotic connotations as well. So any given person would probably, somebody that was sort of wealthy and could wear a lot of perfumes and, had the sort of bodily stability to be like laden with jewelry and perfumes as opposed to sort of digging holes in a field the whole day, which might not be ideal if you were wearing tons of that stuff. They would wear multiple things at any given time. And so one thing that was important was to combine this right. And I mentioned before, these things can be hot and cold. There's seasonal variation. Garlands might be seasonal as well. So there's one story I want to just sort of briefly describe. It's from a text sometime mid-late, it's hard to know, first millennium, the Brihat Katha Shloka Sangraha. It's a fascinating story cycle, like kind of really funny as well, to be honest. Everything in that text is like upside down and topsy-turvy, and you never know what's really going on. But there's a story in that about a prince and who's obsessed with perfume. And basically, there's a whole backstory. But this other guy wants to get to know this prince because he's trying to sort of set him up with a woman for very complicated backstory reasons, which I can't even remember myself. It's all very... Things are not what they seem in that text. But anyhow, this guy has to sort of make friends with this prince to sort of, help him meet this woman. And the way to do this, because the prince is obsessed with perfume, is to pretend to be an expert on perfume. So the sort of imposter, as it were, shows up and he goes, "Oh, I've heard you're into perfume. I'm a big expert in perfumes." And the prince is a bit skeptical, in fact. And so he kind of goes, well, he says, "Oh, come in," and he sort of brings him in. And the prince, if I remember rightly, he's sort of wearing a certain garland and he burns some incense. He just puts a bit of incense on. And the pseudo-expert goes, "Oh my God, I've got a migraine," and sort of grabs his head and freaks out. And the prince goes, "What's wrong?" And he goes, "Oh, that incense and that garland do not go together. That's disgusting. That's terrible. That's really bad." And he goes, let me do an incense. So he gets a little box out and sort of mixes all these bits and bobs and makes an incense that would go with everything and burns that and goes, "Oh, that's much better. This goes together. So that was, as well as like having all these different things on your body, you had to match them as well and match them with the seasons. And so that's just a sort of an important aspect of it. It's very different in a way to, say, how Americans might wear perfume. They just have this one thing, they wear it all year round, just that's it, one thing. That's very, very different. And it required knowledge. You think you've got to have knowledge about how to make these things, but knowledge about how to combine them. It's a bit like, I don't know, food and wine or something like that. Yet again, I mentioned this before, seasonal, and this is still the case in India. Some things are heating, some things are cooling. Musk is very heating, sandal is cooling. Actually, musk's an interesting one to mention because obviously musk, you don't get much musk today in India. So some of the sort of prominent aromatics have sort of faded out of the picture a bit in more modern periods. Agar wood is less common, like the agar of agarbatti is not that common these days, at least in India. Big in the Middle East. Another thing with the combinations is we're not just combining these materials on your body, but you're combining them, in a given perfume. So typically, even that very simple sandalwood paste I showed at the start has camphor and saffron in. But a lot of the recipes have, like the incensers and pastes, have very complicated combinations of ingredients, which of course would have to go together. And there was even a theory of combinations where there's a sort of assignment of ingredients to these categories, which I think it might have come from alchemy originally, where there's allies, allies and enemies and neutrals. And so an enemy ingredient is something that's really strong, like camphor, and you've only got to put a little bit of that in. Neutral, you can put a medium amount in, and friendly ones, sort of ally-friendly ones, you can use a lot of. So you have to sort of get that balance right as well. But you have these really complicated combinations. I'll show you this recipe here. This is a good example of how this is from the Brihat Samhita, sort of mid first millennium of Varahamihira. And so this is a magic square recipe. And this is a small one. This is a simple one. This is like a really simple one. There's kind of grids like this of perfumery combining in later texts that where you get over 100,000 possible perfumes you can generate from them. And actually, Varahamihira in this text, which is an earlier version of this combination stuff, he uses this as a jumping off point. I'm not a mathematician, but he uses this as a jumping off point to actually explore the mathematics of combinatorics, which I don't understand at all. But there is this mathematical combination thing going on. So here we have the recipe, which is complicated, and I didn't translate most of the ingredients here. That's a whole other thing. So you make this grid and you put these quantities in them, and it all adds up to the same. Whichever way you go on this grid, you end up with the same quantity. Is it 18? And so I think it's 18, isn't it? Yeah. 18. You get sort of 18, I don't know, ounces or whatever volume you're using. You always get 18, whichever way you go on this. And this is like a small one. And it's this kind of machine for sort of sort of generating multiple combinations. And like I said, this is a modest, simple one. Let's see. So this one is when you take 4 at the bottom here. When you take, it doesn't matter. When they're mixed in a 16-fold grid, they make 18 parts. And then you sort of perk it up with naka, which is this shell operculum stuff, tagara, which is a root, and frankincense, and then add these pungent things like nutmeg, camphor, and musk, which are they'd probably be in the enemy category of really strong things. And you sense it. Sorry, that shouldn't say molasses. I sometimes put that for Americans because they don't know what jaggery is. And you sense it with that. And you make a perfume called sort of Magic Square, basically, auspicious in all directions. So that's just an example of the combinations. So there's combinations on your body, combinations with the seasons, and then the perfumes are all about combinations as well. Let's see. Sorry, I just got to go back. Yeah, so what are the purposes of perfumery? We don't need to go into this too much. This is from a really interesting text, one of the few sort of lengthy texts that survives that are just about perfumery. This was discovered, it's in a library in Pune, and this, actually I should mention, is very major scholar, P.K. Gode, who is the librarian at the Bhandarkar Oriental Library in Pune, who discovered these manuscripts and sort of worked out what was going on with them and wrote about them, and who really is the original scholar of perfume history in India, P.K. Gode. And these amazing volumes you can get online, these studies in Indian cultural history. If you just go and download them and just spend time inside them. There's all sorts of wonderful things in them. So this is the beginning of that text. So these perfumes, you can use them for the worship of the gods. They make men thrive. They produce the sort of Trivaga, sort of Dharma, Artha, and Karma. They're useful for that. You can imagine how. You can sort of use them in royal ceremonies. You can use them in religious rituals. You can use them in a bedroom. They remove your misfortune. They please kings. And they delight the mind of the cultivated lady. So very sort of much sort of political and social. They're all about communication. You know what I mean? It's not sort of solitary pleasure. It's all like interaction. And yet again, it's that thing of smell for me goes over there. You know, it's all about highlighting, intensifying relations with other people. Let's see. Some of these perfumery texts have what's one interesting thing that really blew my mind about them is even in the early one, the Brihat Samhita, they have playful names. Some of them. So this is rather charming one. So this is an incense. I haven't given you the recipe. I actually did once create this, I think. So you make this incense, and so when you've sensed your body with that incense, when you walk down the street, smelling of that, people go "Kogachati." You know what I mean? Like who goes there? You know what man goes there? And therefore, the incense is actually called. The incense name is actually, who goes there? Who's he that goes there? And then there's other names like shame of a respectable woman. There's a lot of ones that like named after various types of arrows, like Karma Dev's arrows and things like that. There's an incredibly complicated one that's like this 3-level riddle, which I can't explain today. It takes about 45 minutes to explain that one. But it's like a cryptic crossword that results in a perfume, is the only way I can describe it. And yet, I mean, it's like, so not only is the perfume a complicated combination, but it's like described in a kind of cryptic crossword. It's like incredible. I want to mention one more little story because this, gives a sense that everyone had access to perfumes. A lot of these materials like camphor would have been very expensive, but there's this fabulous Buddhist story in one of these Buddhist Jatakas, which this is the Pali version. And what here we're dealing with the Buddha to be in a previous birth is this terribly clever boy, sort of genius boy who's just can do all sorts of amazing things, and this king wants to, he's heard about this, and so he goes, tell me, give me an example of this really clever boy I've been hearing about. So the example they tell him is that at one point a poor woman, she was bathing and she'd got this braided necklace of some sort, doesn't say what it's made of, and it was centered, and she takes it off to bathe, and then this very, very rich woman comes past and really likes this necklace. It's kind of like a lot of the Jatakas, it's a bit humorous, and goes, "Oh, I really like that bathing woman. That's a really nice necklace. Can I try it on just to sort of work out what fit I am?" And the bathing woman goes, yeah, try it on so you can work out, how to make one yourself, if you know what I mean. And the rich woman just puts it on and runs away like that. And then the poor woman's like, "Hang on, you've got my necklace." So she sort of chases after her, and they end up in the town and they're fighting about it. And the rich woman's like, "No, this is my necklace." And so they're having this big argument about, who stole the necklace and things like that. And they bring along this little genius Buddha-to-be boy. And he goes, "Hang on, I can sort this out." And so he brings, he goes, bring a perfumer. So they bring a perfumer, and the perfumer goes, "Right, so take the necklace off and put it in a bowl of water." And then he sort of sniffs it. And he goes, "Right, so rich woman, what's this scented with?" And she goes, "Well, I always wear this all combination perfume," which suggests combination, but also is probably made out of expensive, rare things. And the poor woman goes, "Oh, I just use this Priyangu. Just Priyangu, that's all I use." And the perfumer goes, "Yeah, this is Priyangu. It's the poor woman's." And so they sort of work out who stole what. But what's interesting about that is we learn a little bit about perfumers, and they were trusted for their amazing sense of smell. We have like cheap perfumes, which are still really, good, if you know what I mean. And in fact, the rich woman would rather have this cheap thing than the posh one that she's got. And let's see, I'll just read that little passage out. So the perfumer goes, he asked the thief first, which perfume did you smear this ornament with? And she goes, the rich woman goes, I always smear it with all combination perfume. Then he asked the other woman. She said, how could I, poor miserable woman, possess all combination? I always smear with priangu flower. And he had a bowl of water brought, put that ornament in it, had a perfume sent for, and said, when you smell the bowl, find the name of the particular type of perfume. He, smelling it, knew that it was priangu and spoke this verse. It is not all combination. Pure priangu diffuses forth. This cheating woman tells a lie. The old lady speaks the truth. So that's just a nice little example of, just gives you the complexity going on, sort of social complexity and the expertise of perfumers. One little thing about this is, yet again, I've been emphasizing the visuals, and this is perhaps the most visually famous aromatic entity in South Asia, I'd argue. So this is Venkateshwara Tirupati there. And I don't know, I mean, I didn't know this, but the white Naman on his forehead is actually a big slab of Borneo camphor that they apply once a week. And sometimes this is given out as Mahaprasad. I receive this as Mahaprasad, and it's camphor, so it's like really intense. And then with the sort of bamboo leaf shaped stripe is, they say, is musk. I don't know what they use these days. But that's just a really good example of the striking visual aspect of these substances as well. They're not invisible like modern perfumes. You can really see if somebody, and that would be 1,500 years ago, that amount of Borneo camphor would cost a fortune. Okay, so I think that's my little sort of rundown over the basics of Indian perfumery and smell. And I just want to sort of talk a little bit now about the Marg. So Naman Ahuja, the fabulous editor of Marg, came to me, and they've been talking about doing a sort of smell issue for a while, or something to do with smell. But obviously it's a visual magazine, so it's kind of hard. It's like, how do you do this visually? So we had quite a lot of conversations about that. And I thought, and also it's a huge topic. Where do you even go with smell and perfumery in India? It's like all sorts of directions you could go in. And I thought that one way to focus it would be to look at perfumes and perfumery. And perhaps not entirely, but largely on sort of the makers, perfumers, a bit like the story I just gave you. I write about that in my piece there. The makers and what we can say about those, because obviously, that's a process, that's a distillation workshop, that's somebody grinding sandalwood, that's something like this, making people. So we decided on that, and then we decided to have a mixture of historians and anthropologists and practitioners, some, and make it somewhat chronological as well. So, I'm just going to give a sort of very brief run through of some of the materials in there. And it really is, I think they're selling them at the top. It's a really fun thing, and it's such a mixed bag of different things in there, whatever you're interested in. And as with Marg do a really good job, in fact, of, I don't know if you're familiar with, like, it's maybe academics kind of can't be clear about anything, and they always want 10,000 footnotes, and, but Marg are really good at like, no, this has got to be readable. This has got to be like digestible. You know what I mean? So they're pretty firm about that, and they make sure the end product sort of looks nice and is readable. So I highly recommend it for that as well. Like I said, I write about perfumers at the beginning, and I actually have a little piece, another visual piece on incense burners. And thinking about how incense burners were sort of often, certain ones shaped like an elephant, for example, are sort of completed by the smoke. The smoke coming out of the elephant's trunk is, you never get that in a museum. The sort of sterile thing in a museum, it lacks the smoke, which kind of completes the sort of visuals. Yet again, a visual smell thing. Let's see. Then we have a really... we're going to talk a bit more about the Marg in a minute, but I'm just going to do a bit of a run through here. Emma Flatt, who works in Singapore, she has this fabulous piece on early modern texts from the Deccan in Urdu and Persian, which have some perfume recipes, but they're kind of magical and astrological. and yet again, that perfumes are doing more than just making me smell nice. They have sort of mystical powers, and she's got some great images there. And so that's a fascinating piece. Neha Vermani, she does a really good piece on Mughal cuisine and smells and odors as well. And that's a point I think I had it on one of the slides, is the kind of line between foods and medicines and perfumes is blurred as well. It's as it still is. Like I was hanging out once with a perfumer in Jaipur. It was winter, and he was like, well, he put a little drop of saffron attar in our tea because it was a really chilly day. And I've also been in other places, so you had chai there, but it was kind of perfume and it was heating. So she talks about that in a Mughal context with kind of perfume food, sort of musk in food and things like that. Absolutely fascinating. Got beautiful Mughal images in that as well. Then there's a couple of pieces in the book by a scholar, Nicholas Roth, who was at Harvard at the time doing his PhD. And he's really obsessed with, and it's really cool, in fact, with Mughal gardens and Mughal art. We're sort of pretty familiar with that. His point is, say, when you see something like the Taj Mahal with the big lawns, is like, no, when it was designed, these gardens were meant to have like fragrant trees, roses, narcissi. They were meant to be like these paradisiacal gardens full of fragrant things. So his work has been to sort of put the perfumes back into these gardens, as it were, put the plants back into these gardens, and also identify a lot of plants on Mughal miniatures. And he's really good at that, which is great skill. So he has a nice piece on champaka and also on roses and the history of roses in India there. He's also done this collaboration with Bharti Lalwani, which is really interesting. They've got a great website called Barge-e-Hind, which is along the lines of what I've been saying of the Barge-e-Hind, and of kind of putting the smells back in these images of gardens and these garden contexts. And then, well, we're going to talk a little bit more about these. We have Ahalya Matthan's wonderful piece on garland weaving, which is, here we have a garland, perfect example of a visual, very ancient. There's garlands in the Vedas. But also, she commissioned these amazing drawings of the garland knotting, and it's all like hands and knots and flowers. And what's fascinating about that is you kind of can't help thinking these methods of doing them, they must go back like over 3,000 years at least. You know what I mean? These techniques and beautifully recorded. So an absolutely fascinating piece there. And then Shireen Hamza, she's a science historian. You get quite a lot of people who do history of science involved with this. She did a really interesting piece on recipes, sort of early modern recipes for sort of travel lozenges for sort of seasickness, which involve aromatics. Yet again, the medicine perfumery line is blurred. But what she did, and this has become quite a thing in the history of science, at least in America, and she sort of did experiments to sort of recreate them, which actually I think some of us have experimented with a bit. And so she sort of, the photos in that are sort of, I think they're all in her kitchen or somewhere, and she's sort of mixing up all this sort of pomegranates and stuff and trying to make these travel lozenges and talking that, and also relating it to her own sort of autobiographical experiences of these substances in India as well. So that's a really interesting one. So it's the medicinal a bit, and it's also experimental. And then we have a really cool piece by Projit Mukherjee, who's currently at Ashoka University. His stuff's fabulous if you've never read it. He does history of science stuff. He just sniffs out all sorts of weird and wonderful corners of Bengali fabulous medical history and stuff, like riveting at every turn. And there's quite a lot of images. He has this collection. He kind of collects things like old bottles and old labels and old matchbooks, you name it. So he's the exhibition upstairs has quite a lot of his stuff. But his piece for the Marg was about this thing. I have no idea how he discovered this. He discovered that there was in Chicago, there was a Bengali started this Ganesh incense company in the early 20th century. Then he hired this Lithuanian recent immigrant, and it became quite a big thing. It was in kind of corner shops, Chinese grocery stores, and it was this sort of big introduction of like Americans. It was very sort of orientalizing, the imagery you'll see in the Marg. very orientalizing imagery. But it was also this kind of introduction of Americans to incense, sort of, as opposed to Catholic Church incense, the idea of these little incense cones and stuff. So he does a really beautiful piece on that and sort of theorizing this sort of Chicago 20th century Ganesh Orientalism. I think they could even made it till quite recently that as well. Let's see. Then actually, and this is something this audience there's a really interesting piece by Aditya Harchand, who's at Emory University grad student, and he found these early 20th century Tamil pamphlets, sort of little booklets, like sort of cheaply printed things, which had various recipes in. And so he looks at one. They've got these amazing little images in as well. These sort of cute little images of flowers and sort of scorpion bites and things like that. And he looks at recipes for fragrance, snuffs, sharbats, and remedies in that. But this is a thing I just thought, just being here, is he found those. He works on Tamil materials, but I'm sure there must be both things like what Project works with, old labels, old bottles, things like that, but also pamphlets in Canada. You know what I mean? There must be materials around this part of India that really untapped. People's grandparents must have like old labels, old bottles, maybe some little cheaply printed 1907 recipe book or something like that. And I mean, this is a thing to emphasize with the history of smell, is that often there's so much to do. There's so much that's not being done. I mean, I'm the first to admit my stuff is early. It's all on Sanskrit. That's a huge limitation in terms of there's a lot I didn't touch. So just think about that. And just if you see anything, don't throw it away. Keep it, give it to a museum or something. Let's see. Let's see. So then Amanda Lancia, another history of science person, historian, she has a really interesting piece on 19th century attar making, and how there was this sort of big change in the sort of 19th century from this sort of courtly, say, sort of Mughal courtly royal families having sort of perfumers and distillers, to it becoming much more industrialized, business owners, investors. And that really sort of changed the whole structure of the industry. And parallel with that, some of these people who have these attar factories started producing these beautiful, say, Urdu printed manuals on distillation. And they're kind of interesting because they're in a way they're quite detailed, but also they also kind of assume you know what you're doing. So, and actually with all these recipes, and it's a thing we're doing with ancient recipes, is like, why did anyone ever write a recipe down when probably the experts knew how to do it? You can say the same for cookbooks as well. Why do you write a recipe down ever? You know what I mean? Especially in early periods. I mean, that's the thing. When you find an old recipe, just like, why did they write this down? So she looks into those, and there's great visuals as well there. And then we have Giti's piece. Giti's been working closely in Kannauj with the various groups there doing distillation. And that is, well, we're going to talk about it a bit in a minute. I don't want to kind of sort of reveal everything, but it's the seminal piece for me on, like, what is sort of the ontology of an attar, what is it, and how are they made, and what's really going on in Kannauj and the history of that. So it's like it really is the benchmark piece on sort of what are attars and who makes them. And I've got one more thing to say, and and then finally a really nice piece by Malaika Shirazi, who's a journalist, and that's about the perfume sellers of Old Delhi, which people often know. Gulab Singh Jyotimal, that's perhaps the most well-known shop. And so she looks at not just that shop, but other shops, because the thing is, people often emphasize Gulab Singh Jyotimal. It has a lot of traditional stuff. It's got this really beautiful old interior. But like, say, in Old Delhi, there's a lot of other perfume shops, and the attars, we'll talk about this, I'm sure, in a minute. There'll be the old things like Attar Gulab that you're smelling now, but there'll be these kind of things that are bright blue and kind of named after football players and things like that. And I think it's really important not to ignore that. It's a sort of fascinating part of what's going on. Okay, so I think, I'm done. I've run out of time, and we'll move on to the sort of next little discussion phase. So thank you, everyone. Okay, so I mean, as with the mark, there's a million directions this could go in, but I thought it might be interesting first to learn a bit more about both of you and your practice and your interest in smell, just like personally, and also your practice in perfumery. and then after that we can talk about your pieces in Marg a bit. So, and then we're going to have Q&A for everyone else after this, by the way. So if you've got questions, we'll get there. So maybe.
Thank you to the BIC and Marg for having us do this together. It really was lovely listening to your presentation, James. So very quickly, I run a perfume factory. My education is in perfumery science and technology, so it's all very bland and practice-based in the sense that I went to the only perfumery school in the world at that point of time, which was industry funded, which means that you were taught in an apprenticeship manner. And so I spent, I think, the first almost 18 years of practicing perfumery from a very Western perspective. You know, you learn the science, you learn how to evaluate, you build a palette of ingredients, you learn how to push those ingredients, and of course you learn process materiality and skill. And about 10 years ago, I started studying, not really working, but studying textiles. And I went to Kannauj and I hung out for about 2-3 months with Pranjal Kapoor, who you know and work with, right, over COVID. Yes, and we did this really beautiful exhibition at the Red Fort on the Kannauj perfumes. And I think what happened to me then is I sort of felt a little, for lack of a better word, slapped in the face, because I had this textile thing happening and I was in Kannauj. And I think what I've been doing now for the last 2 or 3 years is not just unlearning the education that I went through, but also relearning, because of the textiles and the Kannauj experience, how to rebuild a practice that is more authentic to who I am and who I live with in India.
Thank you. Giti, maybe.
Yeah, that was so interesting to hear your story. I actually, so I started because I discovered distilled attars in Gulab Singh Jory Mill, actually. So I had been buying synthetic attars and I didn't realize, you know, the perfume was called Jasmine Sandbach and I thought it was made from the flower. And then once I got interested, I just started asking more questions, and then I found out that wasn't the case. And then when I asked to smell something made from the flower, I remember smelling Motia, and, you know, it was such a revelation. It was like going from 2 dimensions to 3 dimensions, and I thought, this is fascinating. And this is sort of more than 10 years ago. So there was nothing on YouTube. There was nothing on Instagram. It was very hard to find out more. So I'm an anthropologist, and so I asked to visit the farms and the distilleries. And as I started doing that, I just got more and more interested. And once I discovered more and more of the attars, I wanted to know how they were used, what was a good perfume, how did South Asians make perfume? And as you say, everything available was the French method. It was Western perfumery. So I actually came across James's PhD thesis and I read all 400 pages of it. You just got a crash course in the first 20 minutes or 30 minutes. But I read the PhD and it opened up this whole world of perfumery from India and how people classified smell, how they experienced it. You know, even just, I think the earliest classification that you mentioned from the Mahabharata, you know, uses terms like smooth and rough and things like that. And so I would smell these materials that I was buying and I would try and think about it and say, is this smooth or is this rough? Is this, and I would try and use the language that people were using before just to have a bit of that experience myself, you know? So it was this kind of weird hobby, weird, very nerdy hobby that I pursued for a long time while I was working. But yeah, it was sort of to cultivate this other sense of smell and this other understanding of perfume. And then I started experimenting with making things with different combinations, but also, you know, the social and spatial aspects that you mentioned. So perfume was not just a personal accessory, it was a social collective experience. It was about the seasons, it was about the environment around you, about the mood that you were trying to make. And it was complex, so complex. So now my practice really is, I would just call it experimental. I do scentscapes, so I try to scent musical performances, festivals, galleries. I make perfumes according to some of these older frameworks that I'm reinterpreting. So yeah, it kind of started as this experiment to experience perfume in a different way. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it's actually really interesting how both of you have sort of been interested to sort of get a new perspective and sort of move away from the sort of French, this hyper-dominant French model, which sort of we're also used to, which is good in its own way, you know what I mean? But there's other ways of doing this, and yeah, and actually, I think there's a lot of work to be done on looking at South Indian texts and how they talk about these materials as well. That has to be done. That does have to be done. So, sure, there's people here who can do that. So maybe, actually, I'm going to throw a little bit of a wild card question at you both now, which is like, what, and it's always interesting to hear, like, what do you wear personally and why most commonly? Give us your like common fragrances that you wear and tell us a bit about them. Bit of a wild card question, but always interesting to hear people like you who really know your stuff. Like, what, you know, it's like asking a composer, what music do you listen to? Like, what do you wear?
So initially I used to wear very few things and I used to wear the same things a lot. Now I wear lots of different things and I'm often just wearing materials that I'm mixing myself because I'm trying to understand how they behave and what they do and how they make me feel. So I don't have an easy answer to that. It's often just these experiments that I use depending on the mood or depending on what I'm doing. Just to, yeah, because each material has its own character, right? And combinations then have another character. So I wear a lot of different things. I very rarely buy perfume and wear it. I buy a lot of perfume just to experience it, but I very rarely buy perfume and wear it. But there are a few, but I can't think of any names that I wear often. Yeah, and I'm sorry.
Do you have a favorite? I mean, I know people hate being asked what's your. It's like filmmakers. What's your favorite film? You know, what I mean, everyone hates that question. Yeah. But do you have a sort of couple of favorites in this sort of Atari realm?
I mean, some of you are smelling Choya Loban. So some of you will have a piece of paper with a really dark brown fragrance on it that is incredibly smoky and quite pungent. And that on its own, I do not wear it like that. That is not meant to be a finished perfume. That's a raw material. But I love using that. I find that smell very addictive. Yeah. And it's hard to find. So it's an uncommon one, but I love that smokiness.
Yeah, I'd never smelled that before today and I was a bit taken with it. Ali, what about you?
So I'm struggling with an answer here because I tend to put on something I'm working on, and it's usually during phases. And then I make everyone else also wear the same thing at different times. So it's not an easy question to answer, but currently I am interested in how skin smells. Just how, you know, a transparency that you would get if you observed or experienced just the sensation of skin against skin or skin against the wind, like you spoke about. And so there are different raw materials that one can use to push this. And so if you came to the factory now, you would find different people in different stages of this, and lots of people groan and moan and say, but we don't want to do this. And it's a good way to know if you're progressing in the correct direction with a brief, because I get client briefs that I have to translate. So it's very rare that I'm doing something out of my imagination. So anyway.
No, thank you. Actually, this is really interesting that I asked that, because it was a bit like asking, you know, musicians, what's your favorite bit of music? No, it's interesting that you're not just like, oh, I love this thing. You know, you've both got like a very complicated personal relationship with it that's kind of hard to define. Actually, that's really interesting. So maybe getting back to the Marg, maybe we'll talk a little bit about the piece you did for Marg. You know, why you chose that and how you went about it, and just introduce it to everyone, because I think a lot of people won't have read it. So maybe Ali, do you want to jump off there? Yeah.
So when I met Naman and I was told about this absolutely lovely issue, can we just hold it up a little bit? You know, I think it really is one of Marg's finest, really finest issues, for many different reasons. And so the piece that I was asked to write about, because we spoke about things that I was interested in, and clearly weaving is something that I'm learning, you know, and which is why when the opportunity to study garlands came through MAG, it meant that I could understand basic things like process, materiality, and skill. I'm not from an art history background. I'm not from a historical, I have no history studies at all. And so I think for me, it really was an opportunity to study both weaving and fragrance explorations with the same mind process, the same kind of application. And what really was wonderful is that MAG encouraged me to visit, I think it was the Satyamangalam Taluk in Coimbatore, where jasmine does grow, and it sort of filtered down the focus to, okay, we'll do this whole experiment from a single ingredient point of view rather than a finished perfume. But in that approach of getting to the article from, a single ingredient, when I actually arrived there, I discovered this whole universe of how a single ingredient can then evolve into a magnificent fragrance, from the moment it's picked to how it's laid out, how jasmine gives out different nuances at different points of the day, how people interact with it. And I thought it was absolutely fascinating because I hadn't yet come to the actual bit where you're knotting and plaiting and weaving in many instances. But that part of the world, and we've heard so much about, Canauge and French perfumery and even how we consume fragrances. But I think that whole South Indian plateau has so much to offer in terms of, I learned about agricultural systems, ancient agricultural systems, Tamil texts that give you strange recipes, pretty much like the ones that you had put. And then so many personal stories that had business records of flowers being picked, how they're used. Of course, there are references to gods because you can't leave out fragrances and garlands and not have the gods as well. So very, 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 very emotionally, I felt like when you first arrive there, it's like the earth is offering you early in the morning. You have like rows and rows of women just plucking jasmine, and it's like the earth is making this offering to you, and it culminates in something that is far more reverential and beautiful in the sense that a single jasmine that you recognize from a field on a garland on a god then has so many different nuances and meanings.
No, thank you. Actually, that's a really good point about the weaving, in fact. And it's sort of also the pervasive metaphor of weaving in the stuff I do, like sort of weaving the year in the Mahabharata. It's like weaving is a sort of ultimate form of making, a woven aromatic. And also with the garlands, what that really brings home to me is how, like, say, the French perfumery is very well designed for putting on a cargo ship and taking around the world and selling 3 years later, whereas like there's no way you can ever experience the thing on my arm without coming here, if you know what I mean, which sort of really changes access. Yeah,
it's not going to last, and that actually makes it special.
Yeah, no, exactly. It's the sort of scarcity value in time is kind of cool. Yeah, no, thank you. And Giti, your piece here.
So with this article, I was writing this while I was doing field work. So for my PhD, I am following the life cycle of two aromatics, two attars, Mitti and Gulab. And I chose these two because these are the most romanticized and the ones that are most often written about. And I wanted to do a deeper dive and tell a more complex story. So I was doing my field work when I was writing this article. And I guess because I had been trying to learn about attar for so long, for sort of, 10 plus years, and struggling to find things that had been written or lectures or anything really that went beyond a sort of very short or narrow or superficial story, and often, again, very romanticized. And it is romantic, so I'm not trying to say it isn't, but, not such complex stories, I suppose. It was so hard to find anything else that I just wanted to write an article that was, just a what is attar, and tell a slightly more complicated and complex story about it. And that was just my objective. So I felt almost like, oh, this might be a little bit boring. but I also felt like it was something that should be done because so many people want to learn more about it, so many people are interested in it, but so much of what is available and accessible is really marketing materials. But there is so much more to that story in terms of the history, as well as the supply chain, the skills, the labor, the meanings. So even just, ru meaning soul, attar meaning essence, and, why are they named these things? What does it actually mean to use the soul of an aromatic? How do people still make sense of that? All that kind of stuff. I just wanted to tell a more complex story about attar.
Well, actually, do you want to maybe expand a bit on how they make the miti attar in case people aren't? It's the most fabulous thing, and there's some of it around. And if you haven't got a piece of it, if you haven't got any, we've got more, so you can kind of come and get some afterwards.
Yeah, so attar miti is, it's an incredible perfume. Nobody knows exactly the history of it in terms of when it started, how it was invented, but it's not in that sense so surprising that it happened in India or South Asia, because that smell, as you mentioned, that smell of the first monsoon rain is so important and has been so aestheticized and celebrated for thousands of years. But basically, it is made so it starts with the kumars, the potters, and they take, historically they used to use talab wali mitti, so earth from ponds, although these days the clay comes from different places, but they used to use that clay, and then they would make the cups, the coolers that you have chai and lassi and things like that in. And so I followed this in Kannauj itself. So I went to the Kumars and they were making these cups. They would then sell them to chai and lassi people, but the ones that would break, those would be sold to the distilleries. So the distilleries would buy those cups and they would distill it, hydro-distill it, using the deg papka method, which, there are photos of that in this issue, and you can find those on the internet now. But they will do this kind of hydro-distillation and use a base oil. So again, historically, that base oil was most often sandalwood, and the one that you're smelling has got sandalwood as a base. And the reason for that is that not all things like these cups do not themselves have an oil. So you need a base, and that base absorbs the fragrance of the cups. And sandalwood, they tell me, was used because it was considered a good preserver of other fragrance. So it imbues the fragrance of the cups and it preserves that fragrance. So you get, sandalwood infused or co-distilled with these cups. It's incredible. It's incredible that they do it. And they don't just do that once. So this is also something, the cups also don't give you fragrance quickly and easily. So every day, and depending on the quality of your attar miti, it could be every day for a week, it could be every day for a month. They will distill new cups over that same base until you get to that desired potency, and then you separate the oil from water. And that is a whole other process that happens post-distillation that often gets missed, but that is a whole complex process too.
Wow, thank you.
Sorry, I was just going to add. So the person who the two of us knew, I think Pranjal Kapoor, he has this really famous little, when he's taking you through his setup, he says, his unit, he says, attar is not a product, it's a process. And I think what you just described, you have to really understand that what you get in a little bottle on a smelling strip is a byproduct of that entire cycle, from the potter to different steps of different craftspeople, actually, even the deg and the babka and the distillation, the pipe, what is it called? Chonga. So if you had to change one of those, like you change the raw material the chonga is made of, it would impact how your processed attar would come out, which would then change the definition of the roux and the attar itself. Yeah. I don't know if that makes sense at all.
No. And it's this sort of time dimension of it all, just how much time goes into these things, and actually the time dimension of this being a very different, and the wearing different things at different times of day, and isn't the you talk about the materials of the stills, isn't the thing with the vetiver that if you've got to use copper, otherwise it doesn't go green? Is it?
Yeah. Yes, that's how you know it's the good stuff. So rukhas, you find some people are selling one and it's dark brown, and some people are selling it and it's green. And it's the green stuff that is more highly valued because it is, it's also supposed to be wild grown, not cultivated, and then distilled in the copper deg.
Yeah. Wow, yeah, thank you.
Hi, I'm Sam. really nice to hear your talks. I wanted to know if you guys have any opinion or if you could shed a bit of light on, the scratch and sniff cards that are really prevalent in the perfume. Like you go and like sort of scratch and sniff, and like if you like it, you get it. And it's probably more prevalent in the West than it is in India or South Asia right now. And if you have any opinions or you've heard anything or you know anything about that and why it is more in the West and not here.
So, can I very, very briefly? It's. I think, and I mean, you'll see this through practice when the precursor to scratch and sniff cards are actually in magazines. You'd have these little strips, and you pull them down, and the fragrance comes out. And what it's meant for is to give you a preview. And it's always accompanied by a really beautiful visual of whatever the perfume imagery that the brand is trying to portray, market, sell. So, what is the purpose of it? Really, to give you a preview of how the smell is going to be. It really is a marketing device. I don't know if that makes sense at all. Why is it more in the West than in India? I've never thought about that, but maybe.
Neither. No, neither. But I mean, I guess our perfume market is quite different here. So much of the expensive commercial fragrance that is alcohol based still comes from the West. India has a massive perfume industry, of course, and it's growing. Like so many new brands are coming up. But I mean, maybe it's simply just a function of the market and how they market. To be honest, I'm not sure that. I don't actually know what in magazines if you're finding a lot of perfume advertising from local brands. I'm really not sure.
So I don't know if this applies to what you are asking, but French fragrance houses typically after the Second World War, you had a lot of couture houses that didn't have clients in fashion for those kinds of clothes, which is why they turned to perfume to keep that clientele. So one little story that we know that you study actually is how Patou launched Joy. This fragrance was created. It was created with a perfumer, and it was called Joy. And he was a couturier, French couturier, who made fragrance for American clients. So the clothes were a certain way. They were more athletic, less feminine, more meant to signify a certain kind of prestige rather than elegance. And he began by giving away little fragrance samples and telling people, telling his clients, I made this specially for you. Don't tell anybody else. And of course, what happened is everybody told everybody else, which I think was the first time a couture house had actually put out fragrance to supplement fashion. And then, of course, you had fashion magazines that came along. So I think even before Vogue, there must have been, I'm not sure of the history of the correct, but Vogue was actually famous for this. So they were meant to attract a certain clientele where if you could not afford couture, you could at least buy the fragrance.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Two things. I've got the smoky perfume. There is one particular tea that comes around China with the flavor of what you actually have here. The second thing I wanted to ask you is this. A lot of the perfumes and the botanicals that are available today are based on plants that have traveled over a period of time. For example, marigolds are not native to India, right? But they're so prevalent in our practice. Nor is rose in its current form. It's not really from here, but it's so prevalent. And this particular form of the rose is what's very prevalent in religious spaces as well. So I was wondering if you have a story of something that surprised you as you worked on your exploration of perfume that you were like, wow, this doesn't come from here, or it was introduced from a certain period of time.
I mean, I was actually surprised about the marigolds when you mentioned that. I could not have imagined that they weren't native because they are so prevalent. I suppose what can I say? I mean, I think what I realized that actually makes the story and the history of perfume here so interesting is actually that so much has come from outside, and then what happens once it arrives and how does it get taken up within the perfume cultures that exist here. And attar is also one of those things. That method of distillation, whenever it arrived, as you said, nobody really knows, maybe 1500s, maybe a little earlier. It arrives here, it comes however it comes, but then becomes something else because it also intermingles with what was already existing. So I no longer expect things to be necessarily native or indigenous, and I personally don't really mind either way. I don't think that's what's interesting, whether something originated here or it originated there. What to me is interesting now is that story of, okay, where did it go? Why did it go? Why was it valued? How did people talk about it? What's the difference maybe between how people use it or value it here versus here? What are the similarities? And this tells you so much more about human culture and how it actually evolves. So yeah, I was very surprised by a lot of things early on, and now I actually find it far more interesting to see how things move around and what that means. Yeah.
So, well, it's really an interesting question because, when I was actually writing that article, you discover that different gods are offered different flowers. And of course, I didn't know till now that marigold is not native to India. But I think what has happened, and you see this in the flower markets before you get to the garland making place itself, that people respond to, especially when you're in the process of making garlands, there's the element that contributes to why this garland for this particular, is it for a wedding, is it for a funeral, is it for a particular god, like Shiva is offered something, Lakshmi is offered lotus. So, there's a whole vocabulary, a whole language which crosses over beyond words, and the flowers actually speak. So it's really quite extraordinary to discover that marigold is not Indian. But having said that, there was this one garland associated with Andal, this parrot garland that is made of 3 different types of leaves, oleander, and I'm not sure now if oleander is Indian or not, but it is, yeah. So 3 different leaves. There is a floral element just to bring out, and it's tucked away inside the garlands. I think they do put rose in it. And they also, secure the leaves and the eye of the parrot with clove. And there's a little red chili added for the beak. So, if you listen to all these ingredients, you'd really think they were making a cocktail, right? Rather than a garland. So it really is, it's really extraordinary to hear that so many things, like you said, does it really make a difference where it originated from if we've taken it and given it a purpose now?
No, thank you. Yeah, actually, for me, the story of this is just more and more is added to the mix as things go. Get geraniums from South Africa, and also they're always assimilated and sort of given various different frameworks. Like rose, it's like rose is cooling. You know what I mean? It's kind of or maybe associated with certain gods, and everything's kind of assimilated in sort of complex ways and sort of made part of the whole system. And it's just the whole thing's getting bigger and bigger in a really awesome way. In fact, very sort of open-minded about sort of new things.
I have a follow-up question, a little bit from what she said, and I actually have 3 questions. One question? Okay. Then I'll pick one. All right. You mentioned that European fragrances and Indian fragrances are more ethereal, they ephemeral, they sort of don't travel well. European fragrances are meant to pack and send across in cartons. In your studies, what was the oldest Indian fragrance to wear personally because we know a lot about garlands and God offering flowers, fragrances, but did ancient Indians wear personal fragrance, and what were those flowers, what were those fragrances? Apart from sandalwood, was there any other personal perfume? What is India's personal perfume, originally?
Yeah, that would be that will be the kinds of things I was sort of showing. So there's, sandalwood, agar wood, which people burned and also made into a paste, saffron, camphor. Those were the kind of musk. Musk was very big. Musk people made a sort of black ink out of. And then people would do something like paint a deer on their face or something, and then or even a rabbit or something, be like, your face is like the moon, you know what I mean? And it'd be heating. So, and lots of these wooden pastes, incenses. I mean, Googaloo goes way back. Sandalwood goes way back. And like I said, it would be a mixture of various formats. But the jasmines, the various, the poverty of the English language for describing jasmine types. But what are, various types of jasmine, I'd say in English, they sort of go way back. So, I mean, the thing is, musk has kind of gone away because it's obviously you have to kill the animal and it's endangered and things like that. And agar wood's very expensive and things like that. But mostly it's kind of cumulative, and so the old things are still here. Yeah, the old things are still here, and it was always a combination you wore, and different formats, and even a given paste might have different things in. Oh, if it was to travel. Well, it's interesting. For my dissertation, I collaborated with this French perfumer, Christophe Laudamière, to sort of recreate some of these things. And it worked. It was good, but they're not the same, if you know what I mean. They're not the same. No. In a way, I don't think you can really reproduce the effect. Say if somebody had multiple garlands and pastes and chewing something, hair oil, in a way, the whole spatial temporal vibe of that, it's kind of hard to do. And also you make them invisible. Once it becomes an alcohol spritz, it's, that's half of the pleasure, if you know what I mean. Any thoughts on that?
I was just going to add to that, which is that I think what is also interesting to look at historically, and you can see it in some of the pieces here, is how while certain things survive, so say garlands, attar for 500 years, whatever, even pastes, let's say the sandalwood paste, these things survive, these methods survive, the aromatics survive. But our sense of smell, our tastes, so many other things have changed so much that they are the same, and yet at the same time they're not. They are and are not the same things. And I feel the same even with attar, which is not even as old. That's maybe 500 years old. And I think, even these ideas of it being the soul of an aromatic, well, we don't have the same relationship with nature that people had at that time. We don't have, so it's sort of thinking even more broadly that the material may be there, the process may be there, the aromatic may be there, but everything around it has changed so much. Yeah.
Yeah, I remember once going to a thing on wine in early modern. Stephen Shapin, famous scholar, and him saying, well, not only is early modern wine different to modern wine, but like what's in your head when you taste and smell wine is not the same as it was in 1600s. So it's kind of, in a way, you can never go back, if you know what I mean. Sorry. Oh.
Hi. Thank you so much for the conversation, by the way. It was great to hear you guys. My name is Abhishek. And quick question. So I essentially wanted to understand how does geography, it's sort of an extension to the previous question, right? The notes that you have in different geographies, right? Say the notes in the East versus the notes in Europe, based on all the local ingredients available there. Do people sort of have like a natural inclination towards notes that are, closer to them in terms of geography, and like they're familiar with it? And yeah, that's like, do we have a natural inclination, or is it subjective? Is it objective to a certain extent? Yeah.
Sorry, so this question took me straight back to we had these classes when I went to school in France, and I like to believe that geography, not so much geography, but your culture contributes to how you process not only smell but taste and sight, and even a sense of beauty. And with smell, there's so much of feeling associated with it. So I always aced the spice class, I mean, there's no way you can be Indian and not just say, oh, coriander, chili, no, 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 because you just know these things, right? And you don't need to sit in an evaluation class and describe, oh, coriander smells warm and I can get this little bit of camphorous note at the end of it, or there's a citrus overtone, because you just know it, right? So yes, to answer your question, from a very practical point of view, there are some things that you just know. And I think that if you look at it in the modern context, and I said to you, you know the smell of Fevicol. You know, yeah, you can smell it now, right? You know what I'm talking about. And so it extends to that, because you and I grew up, I'm assuming, over here. And it's something that we know from another activity of sticking glue and sticking paper. So I think more than geography, your experiences contribute to that understanding and relationship, not just with smell, but the ingredients that smell carries with it. But on the other hand, in the same evaluation class, and this is a story I tell all the time, we were asked, how does camphor smell to you? And in India, we burn camphor. And the rest of the class, we were just a small group of 20 people, and everyone said camphor is cold, because in the West, it's just placed in a room over there. And for me, it's just, I cannot imagine camphor cold at all. It's like speaking Russian. If you spoke to me in Russian, I wouldn't understand a word. So I don't understand what cold camphor means at all. So in more than geography, again, it's just your personal relationship. And people have those common experiences, but also individual experiences as well.
Building on this, so in sensory studies, I can't remember if it's Constance Klassen or David Howes, but these are the kind of most famous scholars in sensory studies. And one of them has this quote, which to that point you've just made, is that the senses are made, not given. So, the senses are made through culture, through socialization, even in terms of thinking about how many senses do you have. That is not something that is universally agreed upon. Everybody doesn't think we have 5 senses. Everybody does not experience the world through 5 senses. For some, it's 6. For some, it's 20, depending on your socialization. So yeah, I think very much it's, as you say, it's enculturation. But I would say in another sense, geography does make a difference, but not maybe in the sense that you were asking. But I think we've had this conversation before about cuss. And so Rukhas may be one of the ones that you're smelling. And it is one of these aromatics that is, I would say, strongly seasonal. So it is meant to be used in hot months because it is cooling. And when I smell it in cold months, it smells disgusting. Like I had to wash it off my skin. I think I remember you saying the same. Like it was sort of almost repulsive. But in hot weather, beautiful. So more than geography, maybe I'm talking about weather, atmosphere, the environment. I think that can absolutely change how you perceive something, but that ultimately you are interpreting it through the lens of culture. Yeah.
Yeah, and I might mention there's a fabulous scholar, she's at Oxford, Asfa Majid, and she's doing this very, very detailed sort of scientific linguistics research, looking at various communities who have dozens of words for smells as opposed to communities that have very poor vocabulary for smells, and doing these very, very carefully controlled experiments to see if they do experience smells differently. And they do a bit, It's complicated, but they do a bit. So there is actually sort of good scientific research there. But I always think about attar and from the north of England. I can't imagine people are terribly excited about the smell of rain. You know what I mean? As opposed to sort of Rajasthanis or something like that. So geography and climate does play a part as well.
We're almost out of time, but we're just going to take one last question.
Okay, I'll keep it short. Some of it is answered in some of the answers before. Thank you for the conversation. It's very enlightening. Many of us aren't so immersed into the world of sensory studies. We just kind of pretty much use what's commercially available. And there is some memory of nostalgia-inducing aromas. My question was, when you look at the world of art, textiles, there is a certain way in which it's tactile, and therefore there's a heritage element to it, which one can capture, see in museums. When you have something like aromas and scents, and there is such a strong heritage story. How can it be captured? Are there any museums? It's so hard. It'll be expensive too. There are barriers to it, understandably. But are there any examples where these kind of, like the one exhibition up here on the second floor is one, but anything that's a little more enduring, where a heritage story has been told of scents and attars and the world of sensory assets or things like that?
So, Izipka, the school that I went to, has what they call an osmothec attached to it. And the osmothec basically is a registry of fragrances that were all created since, I think, I can't remember the name of the queen, but some French queen. I think it was Catherine something. No idea. Yeah, maybe, because she was so associated with the gloves and that story as well. So they have the formulas, and what they do is, it's really interesting because all of these fragrances come with heritage stories, right? She used this fragrance and she used it with the gloves, and that's, again, my education is so Western, I can't really give you any Indian examples, but it is a registry of fragrances that were created since that point of time with the formulas, and they go to great lengths to follow the same process, the same materiality, and the same skill in recreating those formulas. So I know that you have to plan ahead. You have to tell them you're coming. You have to tell them what you want to smell, which means that you have to prepare to go there. You can't just like land up and, oh yes, this is a lovely story, because there's so much to smell. And so yes, this one place actually does exist. It's called the osmothec. Do you want the mic, Shama?
In Kochi, I went to. There are two places, because I think South India has a lot of, resources like this. So I think there is one in Kochi which is very Indian, very simple. You can just go and see and smell all these wonderful things. So I think it's been part of our own culture and obsession, because we are. I mean, like when I was very small, I remember simple. If there was a occasion, they would give you really small little bouquet, and that had these beautiful jasmines and these leaves that have so fragrance. I think in India we do have. I think probably also something in the north, but in Kochi there is one museum or two.
Can I leave you with a question? Do we really need museums to smell?
So actually we're in an interesting moment because attar is being repackaged as a heritage product as we speak. It's been happening for a few years. In terms of the public discourse around attar, this is happening. And there is all this scaffolding that goes around that. So tourism in Kannauj, the UP Tourism Board, there is a perfume park that has been in the works for a long, long time. I believe you were saying there's now potentially also a museum. So these types of things are being talked about more, and people are looking at it because there is, it's an interesting, it is an interesting idea and process, and it also is not so straightforward, because when we talk about heritage, we also are often trying to locate a moment when something was authentic and then let us recreate it from that moment of authenticity. And of course, it does not work like that either. So it's actually quite a complicated thing to do, and it is interesting to see how it is unfolding, but these conversations are happening certainly around attar, as far as I'm aware.
Thank you. Yeah, and I guess one thing I might just throw in there is then you get into these problems of like if you've got some musk product that's like some musking, like how are you going to do that? Like a proper real musk, which is kind of different to all these synthetic musks. So they didn't get into ethical issues with some ingredients as well, and then sometimes you just don't know. The thing is, I translate half the time we don't know what those words really meant. So it's no really for ingredients. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.